On September 16, 1620, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers. What followed was a 2-month journey across the Atlantic Ocean that would transform American history forever. Initially, they intended to settle in present-day Manhattan as part of Virginia. However, this did not come to pass. Turbulent waters and storms sent the Mayflower north of its destination. Instead of arriving in Manhattan, they landed at Cape Cod. Fierce winds and rough conditions made it impossible to safely travel south to their original destination, so instead they decided to return to Cape Cod. On November 11, 1620, the Mayflower dropped anchor in the natural harbor near what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts, at the northern tip of Cape Cod. Having been blown north, the Pilgrims were now outside of the Virginia colony's jurisdiction, and thus many of the agreements they had signed beforehand did not apply. This raised a number of questions regarding what to do next. It is of note that only a third of the Mayflower's passengers were the devout Puritans which most picture when thinking of the Pilgrims. The other 2/3 were called the strangers. These strangers were a mixed batch of people from a variety of backgrounds and were not necessarily even Puritans. Some became nuisances, others leading members of the colony. Mayflower passenger and prominent pilgrim William Bradford recalled the sentiment of some on board the ship at this time in his later writings. Some of the strangers amongst them had let fall from them in the ship that when they came ashore they would use their own liberty, for none had the power to command them, the patent they had being for Virginia and not for New England, and partly that such an act by them done might be as firm as any patent, and in some respects more so. To limit these unruly individuals, an agreement was penned which was to outline the government of the colony the passengers were soon to form. This agreement, known as the Mayflower Compact, combined the settlers into a body politique, a democratic government in which the settlers would elect their own leaders from among themselves. Those who signed it agreed to obey the government, elected officials, and their laws. On November 11th, the compact was signed by all 41 adult men on board the Mayflower who were soon to settle in the colony. They also decided to remain under British sovereignty to ensure a steady supply of vital goods to the colony and protection from outside threats. After the arduous transatlantic voyage, the Mayflower passengers were exhausted and low on supplies. Once on the shore of Cape Cod, they gathered wood, washed themselves, and surveyed the land. However, they were still lacking food and clean water. An expedition of 16 armed men was prepared in hopes of finding food and water, becoming familiar with the land, and making first contact with the natives. The expedition was led by Captain Miles Standish, a soldier and military advisor to the Pilgrims. He was a bold and daring leader, but was also considered cruel by many of his contemporaries for the way he dealt with the Indians. He was a man of short stature, originally hailing from England. Not much of his early life is documented, but we do know that he spent time in Holland, where he came into contact with the church in Leyden, composed of English exiles who would become the Pilgrims. This led to him being hired as the military advisor to the Pilgrims. Other notable members of this expedition were William Bradford, future governor and historian, and Stephen Hopkins, a merchant who was also an early settler in Jamestown. On Wednesday, November 15th, they began their journey. At first they marched in a single-file line along the shore. The men had traveled about a mile when they first came into contact with the locals. At a distance, the party saw 5 or 6 Indians with a dog, who, once noticed, retreated into the woods. The expedition pursued, both in the hopes of speaking with them and finding their settlement, but they were not able to catch up. They began following the tracks left behind by the group of Indians, but soon nightfall came and the expedition set up camp for the night. The next morning the pursuit continued. They traveled further into the woods, crossing creeks, valleys, hills, and dense foliage. As time went on, the expedition's meager supplies waned. The group hoped to come upon food and water, both to replenish themselves and bring some back to the ship, where the supplies were equally as scarce. The men were struck by luck when they were exploring a valley. The valley itself was deep, full of tall grass and brush, and littered with animal tracks. They found a deer and soon after came across springs of fresh water. After quenching their thirst, the expedition began making its way to the beach. Once there, they lit a fire to notify the others of where they were. However, they were not yet finished. After traveling along the beach for a bit, the group once again moved inland. A path was discovered which led to an assortment of sand heaps. One was covered with some old mats, which piqued the interest of the men. They dug up the heap to discover a bow and a set of rotten arrows. They realized that what they were digging was a grave, and thus returned the items to their resting place and left them be. Nearby, they discovered the remains of a house, a set of old planks laid together, another grave, and a large kettle. The kettle was European. The men ascertained that it once belonged to a ship. The grave appeared to have been made recently, and once dug up revealed several baskets of fresh corn, numbering 36 ears in total, enough to alleviate the entire colony's hunger for the time being. After consulting with one another, the expedition decided that they would take the kettle along with as much corn as they could carry and rebury the rest. If they were to stumble across the Indians to whom the items belonged, the plan was to return the kettle and compensate them for the corn taken. They moved toward a river they saw in the distance, and on their way they found even more ruins. This time it was the remnants of a fort or palisade which seemed to have been inhabited by Christians. Given the area that they were in, it is possible this had once been an English fishing post or something of the sort. Upon finally reaching the river, they found two canoes, one on their side and one on the other side. The men would have stayed to investigate further, however they had agreed not to be out for more than 2 days, and so began their trip back to the ship. They stopped at a freshwater pond they had discovered previously to refill on water and set up camp. That night, the men made a large fire along with a barricade before going to sleep. There was at least one man at any given time standing guard in case of an attack, which, luckily for the expedition, never occurred. On the morning of the 17th, they filled the kettle with water from the pond before continuing their way back. The men got lost, and while wandering through the woods they came across a strangely contorted tree sprout with acorns spread underneath. Stephen Hopkins quickly identified it as a makeshift deer trap. This intrigued Bradford, who came to examine it up close when suddenly he was jolted by the trap, which had snagged his leg in a noose. He was unharmed, and the rope used in the trap was brought back with them to the ship. After a bit of hunting and scavenging, the men reached the Mayflower, discharging their muskets into the air to alert the crew of their presence. They were picked up by the ship and presented their findings to the others. Though the first expedition was a success, it was hindered by the fact that it took place entirely on land. On board the Mayflower was a smaller shallop which had been disassembled so as to fit on the ship. This meant that upon the arrival of the Pilgrims at Cape Cod, the shallop needed a large amount of work by the ship's carpenters to make it functional. By the 27th, after 2 weeks of work, the shallop was ready for use. Eager for another expedition and to find a good place to build the colony, 24 men were chosen to go on a second expedition, this time making use of the shallop. Christopher Jones, captain of the Mayflower, asked if he and his men could join the expedition. This was accepted, and in gratitude for his assistance he was made the leader of the expedition. They departed on November 27th, the men on the shallop numbering 34 in total. Immediately after leaving the ship, they were battered by storms, forcing them to take harbor for the night and go through knee-deep waters to take cover on the shore. They decided to continue on without the shallop until the weather improved. That night, it snowed as the temperature dropped to freezing, all while the wind still blasted the party on the shore. By the next day, the weather had subsided, allowing the expedition to continue on the shallop as they made their way back to the river they had formerly discovered the canoes at, which is now called the Pilmouth River. Here the men disembarked to begin exploring. The river itself was decided not to be deep enough to harbor large ships like the Mayflower, though it could still carry smaller boats. They returned to where they had discovered the corn and gathered the rest. To their delight, they found even more sandhills with even more corn, beans, and wheat. This again helped bolster the Mayflower's meek food reserves and provide the colony with seeds which would later be used for farming. Captain Jones desired to return to the ship to avoid an oncoming torrent of foul weather. However, many wished to continue exploring, and so the expedition's ill and weak returned to the Mayflower with the corn, leaving behind 18 men to continue exploring. In search of an Indian settlement, the group followed paths and trails into the woods. In some plains, they discovered what appeared to be a grave. Quote, "But it was much bigger and longer than any we had yet seen. It was also covered with boards, so as we mused what it should be, and resolved to dig it up, where we found first a mat, and under that a fair bow, and there another mat, and under that a board about 3/4 long, finely carved and painted, with 3 tins or brooches on top, like a crown. Also, between the mats we found bowls, trays, dishes, and such like trinkets. At length we came to a fair new mat, and under that 2 bundles, the one bigger, the other less. We opened the grater and found it in great quantity of fine and perfect red powder, and in that the bones and skull of a man. The skull had fine yellow hair still on it, and some of the flesh unconsumed. There was bound up with it a knife, a packing needle, and 2 or 3 old iron things. It was bound up in a sailor's canvas cassock and a pair of cloth breeches. The red powder was a kind of embalmment, and yielded a strong but not offensive smell. We opened the smaller bundle likewise, and found of the same powder in it, and the bones and head of a little child. About the legs and other parts of it were bound strings and bracelets of fine white beads. There was also by it a little bow, about 3/4 of a yard long, and some other odd knacks. They took some of the items and returned the corpses to their resting place. They dug several other graves, but none produced any more corn or valuables. Nearby, 2 desolate Indian huts were discovered. They were cylindrical with walls made of mats. They contained basic homemade appliances such as bowls, pots, and an English bucket. The most interesting thing discovered was several deer heads, one of which being freshly killed. Also littered across the house were deer feet, horns, and eagle claws. Again, the men took some of the best items, intent on returning to leave beads in the houses as a sign of peace. It is of note that in the first 2 expeditions they only set eyes on the local Indians once, at the start of the first journey into the area, and from that point on never laid eyes on natives again even once in either of their explorations. After looting the houses, the men returned to the shallop and made their way back to the ship, ending the second expedition. After the expeditions, the Pilgrims were far more familiar with the area of Cape Cod. They now had a decision to make. Were they going to plant their colony in Cape Cod, or continue searching for a better location to settle? For one, they had discovered a river which could be used as a port and harbor, even if only for small boats. In their expeditions, they had discovered that the ground was good for farming, paired with the fact that the corn seeds they possessed came from the area, and it was not guaranteed that they would perform as well in a different environment. Cape Cod was also good because of the abundance of fish in its bay. Not only was there cod, as the name suggests, but the passengers aboard the Mayflower saw whales swim around them daily. This abundance also led to a great amount of traffic from English fishermen, bringing business to the area seasonally. The Cape was also easily defensible due to its narrowness. However, the primary reason many wished to settle in Cape Cod is because supplies on the ship would not last long, illness and colds were prevalent among the passengers, and winter was approaching. They could not afford to waste time, and could not spend too long searching for the optimal place to plant. However, there were also some issues with settling in Cape Cod. The river they found there was not capable of housing large ships like the Mayflower, which would greatly hinder trade and transportation for the colony. Another issue was that though the Cape had fresh water, it was in ponds which would likely evaporate or recede during the summer. Even if they did not evaporate, the ponds were atop steep hills, which made it tiresome to get to. Finally, the primary reason they decided not to settle in Cape Cod is because they hoped to and believed they could discover somewhere better to settle. Some suggested that they move north and settle in Ipswich, a place known as a good harbor and fishing ground by English fishermen. However, Ipswich was decided to be too far away, so they decided to explore for somewhere better to found their colony. Robert Coppin, one of the crew members of the Mayflower, recalled there being a good river and harbor nearby, capable of carrying large ships like the Mayflower. A third expedition was prepared, this one much farther away than the previous ones. Also at this time, Peregrine White was born, the first pilgrim born in New England. On December 6, 1620, they departed on the shallop and began sailing down the coast. They saw the local Indians again for the first time in almost a month. There was a group of no more than a dozen who, upon seeing the Englishmen on their boat, scrambled away. The weather was freezing cold and the men were tired after a long day of sailing. They came ashore and began setting up camp. A barricade was made, firewood was gathered, and a couple of the group were selected to stand and watch as the rest slept. That night in the distance, the smoke from the Indians' campfire was visible some 4 or 5 miles away. The next day the Englishmen split up. About half explored on the shallop while the other did the same on land. The land expedition searched the area where they had seen the Indians on the shore. They found where they had been cutting up and preparing to cook a large fish. The Indians had abandoned it when they scrambled into the woods earlier. There were tracks leading away which the men followed. At this point, the shallop and the land expedition lost sight of one another. The tracks led to a path which led to yet another burial ground full of graves. This time the men left the graves alone and carried on. A group of Indian houses numbering 4 or 5 were discovered nearby, abandoned like the rest. The men took a couple baskets of acorns and went on their way, not lingering in the area. As night loomed, they rushed out of the woods, making their way back to the shore. They alerted the shallop to their position, and the two groups reunited before making camp for that night. They gathered firewood and took the usual precautions of building a barricade and stationing a guard to stand watch for the night. It was a much-needed rest after days of exploration. Several hours later, they awoke to the sounds of hideous cries followed by the hurried call of the guard to arm themselves. They fired off their muskets, to which the noise ceased. Confused, the men wondered what had caused the commotion. One of the crew said that they had heard similar noises in Newfoundland, and concluded that the noise came from wild beasts, most likely wolves or foxes. This explanation was accepted, and with the threat scared off, the men returned to sleep. The next morning, the men prayed, made breakfast, and prepared for another journey. As a start, they began carrying their things down to the shallop. The tide still being low, they set their items down on the shore and began eating their breakfast. Suddenly, the cries erupted again, louder. One of the men came running frantically, shouting that a horde of Indians was approaching. Soon, a volley of arrows was launched at the Englishmen as they rushed to retrieve their weapons, which were still on the shore with the rest of their equipment as they dodged oncoming arrows. Captain Miles Standish fired off shots as the rest began setting themselves up to join him. He instructed them to hold their fire until the enemy got near to save ammunition. They took cover behind their barricade and defended to prevent the Indians from taking their stuff. Another group of the expedition's members defended the shallop. As the Indians began their assault, one stood out as particularly bold, firing off volleys of arrows from behind a tree. Assuming this was their leader, one of the Englishmen lined up his musket and fired at the man, who in turn let out an extraordinary cry before the Indians turned back and began to flee. The Englishmen pursued the routed Indians to show that they were not afraid of them. After things calmed down, the expedition returned to their camp and found 18 arrows scattered about, some with tips made of brass, animal horns, and some were even made with eagle claws. None of the Englishmen were hurt, despite many close calls. They titled the beach on which the skirmish took place, First Encounter. After their run-in with the local Indians, the expedition continued on its journey to the rumored harbor. Soon after, the weather intensified, and in a storm of rain and snow, fast winds damaged the shallop's rudders, preventing it from steering. To control their direction, 2 men got out oars and began manually rowing the boat until the issue could be fixed. Finally, the harbor was spotted in the distance, a relieving sight offering shelter from the turbulent weather. However, as they approached, the whipping winds from the storm overwhelmed the sail, breaking the mast of the shallop into 3 pieces, sending the sail itself into the water. This would have been disastrous had they not been so close to their destination. Luckily, they were able to drift the rest of the way into the harbor. Unfortunately, this turned out to be the wrong harbor. The one they were searching for was just a little further ahead. The men made their way to an island, and here they set up camp for the night and recovered after a long day at sea. The following morning, they explored the island and recuperated for the rest of the day. The island was found to be uninhabited and thus a safe place to make camp. The next day was Sunday, and the party observed their traditional Puritan Sabbath, praying and resting. Finally, on Monday, December the 11th, they began exploring what would come to be known as Plymouth Harbor, the birthplace of their new colony. Quote, "We sounded the harbor and found it a very good harbor for our shipping. We marched also into the land and found diverse cornfields and little running brooks, a place very good for situation." Satisfied, they returned back to the Mayflower and relayed the good news of their findings. On the 15th, they weighed anchor and sailed the Mayflower to Plymouth Harbor. On the 18th, further explorations of the area began. They discovered a lot about the local wildlife and habitat. They also found the area to be uninhabited by Indians, though they found their crops planted about. Their discoveries only added to their certainty that this was the correct place to plant their colony. They could no longer stall or search for a better location. Their supplies were dwindling and the ferocious New England winter was approaching rapidly. From their search parties in Plymouth Harbor, they decided the optimal spot to begin building was one particular area they had found, which was atop a hill, on the mainland, and already had land cleared and ready for farming. This area also had several streams of fresh water which they could drink from and which also was home to a decent amount of fish. Being on top of a hill would also allow them to view their surroundings, including Cape Cod and the sea. Here they also intended on setting up their cannons. It was finally decided. After over a month of searching, 3 expeditions and several hurdles along the way, the Pilgrims had finally found a place to begin their colony. However, their hardships were far from over. The most vicious part of the winter was still on the horizon and disease began to take its toll on the settlers. But now at least they had a home base, a solid shelter where they could begin construction of houses, farms, churches, and fortifications. From this small settlement, an entire colony was born, one which would become home to thousands and influence several colonies afterwards. After finally finding security following a harrowing journey across an ocean, it came time to name their new settlement. When the Pilgrims looked to their maps to see where they were, they discovered that the land they now inhabited was named Plymouth, after the English city from which their journey began. They kept the name, which was soon used for their entire colony and not just its capital settlement. Immediately, a common house was constructed which would be used as a meeting hall to organize the colony. They now had a solid foundation from which to expand and develop, becoming the first permanent English settlement in New England, the first of many, which would play a large role in shaping America's identity as a nation.